Hey guys, it's Karenology. This one is pure chaos. You have to hear how it all went down.
I always thought my little beach cottage would be my escape from the chaos of life. Nestled on a quiet stretch of sand, it had been in my family for decades, untouched by the world of homeowner associations and petty rules. But everything changed the day I noticed something strange about my electricity bill. The numbers didn't add up. Despite being away from the cottage for weeks, the bill was astronomically high. I assumed it was a clerical error until I visited the property and saw them. Thick black cables snaking from my breaker box into the ground, disappearing toward the neighboring development. I knelt down, tracing the cables with trembling hands. They weren't part of my setup. Someone had connected their power supply to my cottage. My sanctuary was being exploited. Furious, I followed the trail of wires through the brush and sand, eventually reaching the edge of a perfectly manicured neighborhood. It was clear who was behind this. Determined to get answers, I approached the gates of the neighboring community. A sign greeted me. Sand Dunes Homeowner Association. Private property. I pressed the intercom button, my heart pounding. "Can I help you?" A woman's voice chirped, dripping with condescension. "Yes," I replied sharply. "I'd like to speak to someone about the illegal power connection from my property." There was a pause. Then the gates creaked open. I walked into a pristine cul-de-sac where a woman in a crisp blazer stood waiting. She radiated the smug confidence of someone who thrived on control. This had to be Karen, the notorious president of the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association. "I'm Karen Wells," she said, extending a hand that I didn't take. "How can I assist you?" "You can start by explaining why there are power lines running from my beach cottage to your community," I snapped. Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, that's a simple misunderstanding. Our community needed an emergency power source during the recent storm. It was a temporary arrangement." "Temporary?" I echoed incredulously. "The cables are still there, and no one asked for my permission." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "We assumed you'd be willing to support your neighbors in a time of need. Besides, it's not like you live there full-time." My blood boiled. "That doesn't give you the right to steal from me." Disconnected immediately. Karen's expression hardened. "I'll look into it. But you should know our association has certain expectations for properties in the area. Perhaps it's time to discuss your cottage's compliance." I left the meeting more furious than I'd arrived. By the time I returned to my cottage, I noticed new problems. A crew from the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association was inspecting my property. They claimed to be checking for safety violations, but it was clear they were searching for leverage. One worker deliberately knocked over my mailbox, muttering about how it was not up to code. Another took photos of my cottage's exterior, focusing on areas they claimed looked dilapidated. It felt invasive and threatening. "Get off my property," I shouted, but they ignored me. I called the police, hoping they would put an end to this harassment. When the officers arrived, Karen conveniently appeared, armed with a clipboard and a sickly sweet smile. "We're just performing routine checks to ensure community standards," she explained to the officers. "We have every right to be here." The officers exchanged glances but didn't press the issue. "Ma'am, this seems like a civil matter. You'll need to take it up with the homeowner association." My frustration deepened. Karen had the system on her side. That evening, I combed through property records and local ordinances, searching for any way to fight back. That's when I found it. A forged document filed with the county claiming that my beach cottage was part of the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association. The document bore my name, but the signature wasn't mine. They were trying to claim my property as their own. Enraged, I drove to the county clerk's office the next morning. The clerk's expression turned apologetic as she examined the document. "I'm sorry, but this looks legitimate," she said. "If you believe it's fraudulent, you'll need to file a legal challenge." Legal challenges meant time and money, resources Karen and her association likely counted on me not having. But they underestimated my resolve. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let them take it. As I prepared for the legal battle, more troubling events unfolded. Drones began hovering over my property at odd hours, their cameras pointed directly at my windows. Strange vehicles parked near my cottage, their occupants watching me for hours before driving off. One morning, I woke to find my fence partially demolished. A note was taped to my door, bearing the Homeowner Association's letterhead. It read, "Your property is in violation of several community standards. Immediate remediation is required." This was war, and I was ready to fight. The first chapter ends with the protagonist uncovering the depth of the conspiracy against her. setting the stage for the escalating battle in the following chapters. The war with the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association had officially begun, and I was determined to win. The fraudulent document linking my beach cottage to their association was a blatant lie, but unraveling their scheme would be a labyrinthine process. My first step was finding a lawyer who could take on Karen and her army of enforcers. That's how I met Daniel Price, a no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for dismantling corrupt organizations. Daniel raised an eyebrow as I laid out my case. "This isn't just about power lines or fake signatures," he said. "If they're targeting you, they're likely doing this to others. We'll need to dig deeper." I handed him every piece of evidence I had collected so far. Photos of the cables, the intrusive inspections, the forged document, and the ominous letter about my supposed violations. Daniel's jaw tightened as he reviewed it all. "They're overreaching, but proving fraud will take time. Be ready for them to retaliate." Daniel's warning proved prophetic. The next day, I arrived at my cottage to find an official-looking sign staked into my yard. "Construction halted. Property under dispute." The note bore the county's seal, but reeked of the homeowner association's meddling. I stormed down to the county office, demanding answers. The clerk avoided my gaze. "There's been a claim filed against your property," she explained. "Until it's resolved, no renovations or repairs are allowed." "A claim by whom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The Sand Dunes Homeowner Association," she confirmed reluctantly. Back at the cottage, I was met by Karen herself, flanked by two men in construction vests. Her smile was as predatory as ever. "I see you've discovered the halt order," she said sweetly. "It's for your own protection, of course. You wouldn't want to violate any codes." "This is harassment," I shot back. "Stay off my property." Karen tilted her head, feigning innocence. "We're just following procedure. If you'd like, we can discuss a settlement to simplify things. Perhaps joining our association officially?" I clenched my fists. "Over my dead body." As I resisted Karen's advances, the neighbors from her community began targeting me too. One night, my mailbox was filled with rotting garbage. Another morning, I found tire marks across my lawn, as if someone had intentionally driven through it. Each act of vandalism felt like a message. Give up. The harassment escalated further when a group of Sand Dunes residents appeared on my doorstep with a petition. They claimed I was a public nuisance for resisting the association's community standards and demanded I comply or leave. I refused to sign anything and slammed the door in their faces, but the message was clear. Karen had mobilized the community against me, and they were determined to wear me down. It wasn't just about power or money anymore. This was personal. With Daniel's help, I started piecing together the homeowner association's larger scheme. We discovered that Karen and her allies in the city's planning department had been systematically redrawing property lines to absorb independent homes like mine into their jurisdiction. In exchange, Karen's association funneled money into city officials' campaigns and pet projects. It was a well-oiled machine of corruption, and my beach cottage was just one target among many. The fraudulent document tying me to their association was part of a broader strategy to expand their influence and increase their dues. "If we can prove this," Daniel said, "it could bring the whole operation down. But we'll need more evidence." Our investigation didn't go unnoticed. Late one night, I heard the sound of footsteps outside my cottage. Peeking through the curtains, I saw two shadowy figures tampering with my breaker box. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruders were gone. The officers found the power lines cut and my security camera smashed. One of them shook his head. "Looks like a warning," he said grimly. "You should be careful." Karen's escalation was getting bolder. She wanted me to know she wasn't afraid to use intimidation tactics, but if she thought I'd back down, she was sorely mistaken. With the legal case underway and the harassment escalating, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started documenting everything: the vandalism, the threats, and every suspicious incident. I reached out to local journalists, hoping to expose Karen and the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association to public scrutiny. My first interview aired on a local news station, showing the cables, the forged documents, and the destruction caused by the association. The story sparked outrage, with viewers flooding the station's hotline with similar complaints about Karen's tactics. But Karen wasn't finished. The next day, I received a summons to court, accusing me of defamation and damaging the reputation of the homeowner association. It was a blatant attempt to silence me, but I saw it as a sign. Karen was getting desperate. The second chapter ends with the protagonist facing mounting legal and personal threats, but also finding a glimmer of hope as public attention begins to turn against Karen and the corrupt homeowner association. The court summons was a bold move from Karen, but it was also her mistake. Instead of silencing me, it only strengthened my resolve to expose the corruption of the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association. With Daniel's guidance, I prepared a counterclaim accusing the association of harassment, fraud, and property violations. The legal fight was heating up, and I refused to back down. As the court date approached, the harassment escalated. My tires were slashed one morning, and someone sprayed graffiti on my fence reading, "Sell and leave." These were deliberate acts meant to intimidate me, but they only fueled my determination. I installed new security cameras and shared the footage with Daniel. "The more evidence we gather, the better," he assured me. One evening, I discovered another act of sabotage. My water supply had been cut off, and when I investigated, I found that someone had tampered with the main valve. It was an obvious attempt to disrupt my life, but I reported it immediately, documenting everything for the court. In the midst of the chaos, Daniel uncovered a key witness, a former member of the Homeowner Association Board who had fallen out with Karen. His name was Mark, and he agreed to meet us in secret at a local diner. Over coffee, he revealed the extent of Karen's corruption. "She's been doing this for years," Mark said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Forged documents, intimidation, payoffs to city officials. It's all part of her playbook. Your property is just the latest target." "Why didn't you speak out sooner?" I asked. He hesitated. "Karen's not someone you cross lightly, but if you're taking her on, I'll back you up. Just don't let her know I'm involved." Mark's testimony was a turning point. He provided documents and insider knowledge that painted a damning picture of the homeowner association's illegal activities. Armed with this new evidence, Daniel and I felt more confident about our case. Karen wasn't about to let me gain the upper hand. A few days after meeting Mark, I returned home to find an official-looking letter taped to my door. It was another notice from the Homeowner Association claiming I was in violation of environmental codes for unapproved landscaping and threatening massive fines. It was laughable, but the timing was strategic. Karen wanted to overwhelm me with legal and financial pressure. That same night, the drones returned, buzzing over my property like mechanical vultures. This time I caught one on camera, its blinking red light clearly capturing footage of my home. Daniel filed an emergency injunction to stop their surveillance, arguing it was a violation of my privacy. The court granted the motion, but the damage had already been done. Karen's tactics were relentless. The first court hearing was a tense affair. Karen arrived flanked by her lawyers, exuding confidence as she took her seat. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't nervous, but Daniel's presence gave me strength. We presented our evidence, the forged documents, the vandalism, and Mark's testimony. Karen's lawyers tried to dismiss it all as circumstantial, but the judge seemed unconvinced by their arguments. Then came the surprise. Daniel called Mark to the stand, and his testimony was devastating. He detailed Karen's schemes with precision, exposing her network of bribes and fraudulent filings. Karen's confident facade cracked for the first time, her eyes narrowing as Mark spoke. It was clear she hadn't expected him to turn against her. The judge ruled in my favor on one crucial point. The fraudulent document linking my property to the homeowner association was voided, and Karen was ordered to disconnect the illegal power lines immediately. However, the broader issues of harassment and damages were deferred to a later hearing. It wasn't the complete victory I hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. As I left the courthouse, Karen brushed past me, her voice low and venomous. "This isn't over." I met her glare with steady defiance. "No, it's not." That night, I returned to my cottage exhausted but resolute. The power lines were gone, and for the first time in weeks, the property felt like mine again. But I knew Karen wouldn't stop. She'd come at me with everything she had, and I needed to be ready. Daniel and I doubled down on our investigation, determined to uncover the full extent of the homeowner association's corruption. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. The third chapter ends with the protagonist achieving a small but significant victory in court, setting the stage for an even fiercer battle to come. Karen's venomous words lingered in my mind as I returned home from the courthouse. Although I had achieved a small victory, it was clear the battle was far from over. Determined to keep the pressure on, I spent the following days working with Daniel to expand our investigation. Mark's testimony had opened the floodgates, and what we uncovered next shocked us both. Digging through financial records and public filings, Daniel discovered that the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association had a shadowy network of shell companies funneling money from residents into Karen's personal accounts. Inflated fees for community improvements and environmental compliance were redirected into a slush fund. Worse, these funds were being used to bribe local officials and contractors. "This isn't just fraud," Daniel said, his voice grim. "This is organized crime." With this new evidence, we filed additional motions in court. The stakes had officially skyrocketed, and Karen knew it. She doubled down on her intimidation tactics, but I refused to back down. One night, as I was reviewing documents, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. I rushed outside to find my car's window smashed with a brick lying on the front seat. Taped to it was a note, "Drop the case or else." Shaking with anger, I called the police, but their response was lackluster. "Without witnesses, there's not much we can do," the officer said, shrugging. Frustrated but undeterred, I installed additional security measures, including motion-activated floodlights and reinforced locks. If Karen thought fear would drive me away, she was sorely mistaken. The next day, I received a call from an elderly woman named Martha. She had seen my news interview and wanted to share her story. When we met, her frail hands trembled as she described how Karen's homeowner association had forced her to sell her home under the guise of unpaid fees. "They said I owed thousands for repairs I never approved," Martha explained, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't fight them. They took everything." Martha wasn't alone. Over the next week, more victims came forward, each with their own horror story of extortion and intimidation. Daniel compiled their testimonies, building a damning case against Karen and her accomplices. Karen's response was swift and ruthless. The day before our next court hearing, I received another legal notice, this time accusing me of trespassing and vandalism. It was absurd, but it forced me to divert resources to defend myself against the bogus claims. At the hearing, Karen's lawyers attempted to paint me as a troublemaker, disrupting the harmony of the community. But Daniel countered with hard evidence: financial records, witness testimonies, and surveillance footage. The judge's stern expression suggested the tide was turning. Later that week, Mark reached out again. "Karen's panicking," he said. "She's called an emergency board meeting. You need to see this." With his help, I managed to infiltrate the meeting, hiding in the shadows as Karen outlined her next move. Her plan was audacious. She intended to destroy key documents and shift the blame onto lower-level employees. "If we act fast, we can contain this," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It was clear her empire was crumbling, and she was willing to sacrifice anyone to save herself. Armed with this insider information, Daniel and I decided to escalate our case further, pushing for criminal charges. But as we prepared to submit the evidence, I received a chilling phone call. "You've gone too far," a distorted voice warned. "Walk away, or you won't like what happens next." The threat was a stark reminder of what I was up against, but it only steeled my resolve. Karen's corruption had ruined lives, and I was determined to stop her, no matter the cost. Daniel and I submitted the new evidence, including recordings from the secret meeting, to the district attorney's office. An investigation was launched, and subpoenas were issued to Karen and her associates. For the first time, it felt like justice might prevail. But Karen wasn't finished. As the chapter closed, I found myself staring at a new challenge: an eviction notice, falsely claiming I had violated zoning laws. It was her boldest move yet, and I knew the fight was far from over. The fourth chapter ends with the protagonist taking a significant step toward justice while facing escalating threats and a new legal challenge from Karen. Karen's eviction notice was the last straw. It was a blatant abuse of power, and I was determined to end her reign once and for all. With Daniel's help, I filed an emergency motion to block the eviction and countered with accusations of harassment and malicious intent. Meanwhile, the district attorney's investigation into the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association was gaining traction. The walls were closing in on Karen. The pressure began to show. Karen's usual smug demeanor was replaced with a frantic energy. Her lawyers were working overtime to contain the damage, but every move she made only seemed to dig her deeper. Mark continued feeding us inside information, revealing that Karen was coercing board members to destroy evidence and threatening them with legal action if they didn't comply. She's losing control, Mark said during one of our secret meetings. If you keep pushing, she'll crack. Encouraged by this, I doubled down. I reached out to the local media, providing them with copies of the evidence we'd gathered. The story exploded, painting Karen and her homeowner association as corrupt bullies exploiting their power. The public backlash was immediate, with protests forming outside the sand dunes gates and residents demanding her resignation. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Late one night, I awoke to the sound of tires screeching outside my cottage. I rushed to the window and saw a car speeding away, leaving a trail of flames. Someone had set fire to my lawn. Panicked, I called the fire department and managed to extinguish the flames before they reached the house. The police took my statement but warned me to stay vigilant. "This could be a warning," the officer said. "Be careful." Despite the danger, I refused to back down. Karen's desperation was a sign that she knew her time was running out. The final court hearing was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and angry residents. Karen's lawyers tried every trick in the book to discredit me, but Daniel was relentless. He presented the forged documents, financial records, and Mark's testimony, leaving no doubt about Karen's corruption. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The district attorney revealed that Karen was under criminal investigation for embezzlement and fraud. The courtroom erupted as the judge ordered an immediate injunction against all homeowner association activities related to my property. Karen's face turned pale as the judge delivered the verdict. This court finds sufficient evidence of misconduct by the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association. All claims against Ms. Hollings are dismissed, and further legal action against the association will proceed. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Karen's empire was crumbling, and my home was finally safe. The media swarmed me for comments, but I kept my words simple. This was never just about me. It's about standing up to those who abuse their power. I'm grateful for everyone who helped me fight back. In the weeks that followed, the Sand Dunes Homeowner Association fell apart. Karen resigned in disgrace, and several of her allies faced criminal charges. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out began sharing their stories, leading to broader reforms in the community. As for me, I finally had peace. The illegal power lines were gone, the harassment had stopped, and my cottage was truly my own again. I planted new flowers where the fire had burned my lawn, a symbol of resilience and renewal. But most importantly, I learned the power of persistence. Karen underestimated me, believing she could intimidate me into submission. Instead, she'd created her own undoing, and while the fight had been exhausting, it was worth it to protect what mattered most. The fifth and final chapter ends with the protagonist victorious, the antagonist brought to justice, and a sense of closure for the audience.